I'm going to begin with a quote from Hilary Mantel, which is, St. Augustine says, "The dead are invisible, they are not absent. We do not need to believe in ghosts to know that that's true. We carry the genes and the culture of our ancestors, and what we think of them shapes what we think of ourselves and how we make sense of our time and place. Are these good times, bad times, interesting times? We rely on history to tell us. History and science help us to put our small lives into context. But if we want to meet the dead looking alive, we turn to art." So today I'm going to speak about my own experiences of commissioning and supporting temporary site-specific artistic investigation and exhibition of temporary artistic works that activate historic buildings and heritage sites in public ownership, which are not normally accessible to the public or in that tricky transitional phase between the two. The two sites in question are 14 Henrietta Street and the Pigeon House Precinct on the Poolbeg Peninsula. In 2008, 14 Henrietta Street, soon to be the Tenement Museum Dublin, has been vacant and unused and abandoned for almost 40 years and was in an advanced state of structural deterioration, suffering the ravages of water ingress, vandalism, significant structural movement, and with ongoing loss of historic fabric from theft. Then in 2008, Dublin City Council was initiated a 2-year project of permanent emergency stabilisation works to save this house from collapse. It was followed by work specifically aimed at weathering the building by repairing windows and doors between 2011 and 2012. By this stage, the house was watertight, but internally it had no power supply, no plumbing, no heating or sanitary services, and its internal finishes were unstable and in places very loose. And a temporary stairs had to be placed over the structurally deficient original one. Also, by this stage, no permanent use had been identified for the building, and our budget would only allow for piecemeal baby steps improvements. We developed a strategy of essential works aimed at promoting temporary cultural uses and public access to the building to best deploy our limited resources available. Then, in 2013, we partnered with the Irish Heritage Trust and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions on a temporary exhibition to mark the centenary of the lockout. Blindsided by the uniqueness of their response to the interpretive exhibition design tender, we appointed the site-specific theatre company Anu to stage a 2-month play called The Dublin Tenement Experience, Living the Lockout, which responded to the historical events and living conditions of the period. It was a hugely successful production which sold out within weeks of opening. It resonated at a deep level with audiences and brought people back to the house and to the street who had left its tenements during the 1960s and 70s. Family reunions were organised, and we continue to this day to work with people we met during this time. It also dramatically raised the profile of 14 Henrietta Street at government level and critically paved the way for the centenary capital funding for the Tenement Museum Dublin. For those of us burdened by the baggage of historical research and facts and the insatiable impulse that all this information must be shared, we worked so hard to compile as well. We developed an interactive website to share this information. Then in 2014, I was approached by the theatre company SJ about the staging of Beckett's prose fragments called Fizzles. Company SJ are a theatre company that fuse performance and research as an active artistic engagement between the two, presenting the work of Irish playwrights and in particular Samuel Beckett. The production fused the two sites that I have been working on for the last 10 years, 14 Henrietta Street and the Pigeon House Power Station. It was staged in 14 Henrietta Street, but incorporated film and imagery from the power station itself. While the prose itself is not site-specific, the production was rooted in the place. Unlike Living the Lockout, this production was fully funded and managed by the theatre company, working with the single actor Raymond Keane and using sound and film projection by the visual artist Killian Waters and the judicious use of lighting. Fizzles had a transformative effect on this house without impacting negatively upon its fabric in any way. Fizzles brought new audiences to 14 Henrietta Street and again raised the building's profile amongst the public, demonstrating its power as a setting for creative practice, cultural engagement and public access. Following the major conservation and adaptive reuse works to 14 Henrietta Street for the Tenement Museum Dublin between 2016 and 2017, Dublin City Council commissioned Anu to revisit the tenement history of the house and to co-create with the curatorial team a new piece of site-specific theatre entitled Hen Town. The play emerged from a curatorial strategy which sought to use dramaturgy, amongst other means, as a way of mediating the museum's narratives and the complex history of this house and the street. but at a more prosaic level, it was a means to activate the museum building during its prolonged fit-out phase and to build its audience base. Informed by the museum's curatorial strategy and the fourth level architectural, social, cultural heritage research commissioned as part of the museum's development, the brief asked Anu to develop a piece of theatre that would be sort of like an abstracted but unbroken flow of images from the 18th to the 20th centuries. It's worth briefly describing the process of making Hen Town and how myself and the project curator, Dr. Ellen Rowley, had to adapt our own expectations and curatorial processes that we had established, and to give Anu the creative freedom and space to respond to the site and the subject matter through their own artistic practice. Following a day of presentations on the architectural, historical and urban social histories, we entered a grueling 6-day development phase where Anu's distinctive iterative process took over. During this week, in response to our continuous fact-checking and requests for information to be included in the play's emerging narratives, we were met with the mantra that exposition is the death of theatre. At the end of this development week, it was agreed that the play would be set in 1963, the year 3 tenement houses collapsed in Dublin, the year in which hundreds of tenement buildings were condemned as unsafe, displacing a large number of families and individuals unprepared for its aftermath. After the development week, we left the artistic director, Louise Lowe, and the 4 actors to develop the play's plots and dialogue during an intensive 3 weeks of improvisation, experimentation and rehearsals. The play finished as it began, without a script, and during its 2-month run, it was subtly adapted in response to specific site conditions and to audience reactions. Public reaction to the play was extraordinary. It resonated strongly with our audiences and deeply so amongst the many people in attendance who had a direct connection to Dublin's tenements, to Henrietta Street and to 14 Henrietta Street. The next site I want to briefly talk about is Pigeon House Precinct. 6 kilometres from O'Connell Street, at the end of the Pigeon House Road, is the Pigeon House Precinct. This site incorporates a mid-18th century maritime harbour, a late 18th century hotel building, 19th century defensive fortifications, and an abandoned 10,000 square metre coal-fuelled power station built in phases from 1902 to the 1940s. And also a large chemical laboratory. The site was handed over to ESB when it was established in 1927, and it remained in use until the 70s when it was decommissioned after the construction of the Poolbeg power station next door. Emptied of its machinery and partially unroofed, the power station was gradually abandoned, and in 2005 it was sold back to Dublin City Council in its present derelict state. Then in 2011 I took a particular interest in the site and initiated a conservation plan process to consider its future. Then, in early 2013, curators Rosie Lynch and Holly Kearns from what was then Commonage approached DCC about a proposal to develop a new series of specific contemporary artworks and research in response to a site in Dublin. So we chose the site of the Pigeon House Precinct and the Poolbeg Peninsula. This project, Landing Place, investigated notions of access with particular reference to the multi-layered histories and ecology of this site. With funding from the Arts Council and modest support from the Heritage Office, the project commenced with a residency in the hotel building and finished with a 2-day exhibition of the work of the artists in May 2013. The decision to support Landing Place was an easy one. Crucial for me was the fact that the work was temporary, site-specific, and it provided limited, safe public access to the site. The creation of original artistic work responding to the specific history of the site and the potential for alternative interpretations of the place intrigued me. And this research and artistic works looked at and then beyond the historical facts, getting under the belly of the place. Just looking at the clock. Sven Andersson's research into the experience of listening led to an oral intervention into the most inaccessible building on the site, the former power station. And a sound installation brought the public into space around the site, gesturing at the inaccessible. The screening of Aoife Desmond's work, Passage Migrants, explored patterns of movement and life on the peninsula. Fiona MacDonald's Access, No Access floated an architectural installation in the harbour, invoking the links to trade and economic prosperity over the shifting development of the peninsula itself. And finally, Emma Nick Thomas presented Lacunae, the outcome of a 3-week durational performance at the former chemical lab building, which explored physical labour and the physical labour of energy production. Now, I'm actually doing okay for time, despite my rushing. So I want to finish up by going back to Henrietta Street and to look at this bed. So working with the producer, Rasha Gone, and the Tenement Museum Dublin team, we commissioned new creative writing from Dublin-based writers for a specialised audio tour that delivers in real time fictionalised narratives based on the social history of the house and the street. The writers were Sonia Kelly, the playwright Sean Dunn, and the poet Paula Meehan, who created a series of 12 poems entitled Museum. Museum will be published in the forthcoming edition of Poetry Ireland Review and will, all going to plan, be formally published later this year or the beginning of next year. One poem responds specifically to this bed. This bed was made for Bartholomew Moss, the founding master of the Rotunda Hospital in 1759. The bed is obviously on display in the museum and will be when it opens to the public. The bed isn't simply a piece of 18th century Irish Georgian furniture. It is a means through which we begin to see connections between the vastly diverging experiences of women in this house from the 18th century and the 20th century. But just to say that the poem, it is an installation that will be, as I said, projected onto the bed, and it is formally part of the exhibition content. But it will be presented in a bed that is being presented as an 18th century bedroom. But rather than the traditional sort of heritage approach of presenting facts about this being a bedroom, we decided to take a completely different approach and use the intervention of an artist using poetry and a visual artist, Killian Waters. So thank you very much.